Chapter 1. The psychology that separates the wealthy from everyone else. Most people think wealth is about strategy, about tactics, about knowing the right business model, the right niche, the right opportunity. And while those things matter, they're not where wealth begins. Wealth begins in the mind, in how you think, how you see money, how you make decisions, how you respond to risk. Because two people can have access to the same opportunity, the same information, the same tools, and end up with completely different results. Not because one worked harder, but because one thought differently. This is the hidden layer of wealth, the psychology behind it, the part that is never obvious, but always present, because your results will always reflect your thinking, not your intentions, not your desires, but your thinking patterns. And if those patterns are limited, your results will be limited too, no matter how much effort you apply. The first difference between the wealthy and everyone else is how they view money. Most people see money as something to earn, something to receive, something that comes from working, so they focus on effort, on time, on output. If I work more, I earn more. But wealthy individuals see money differently. They see it as something to build, to multiply, to direct. They don't just think about earning money. They think about how money can create more money. And that shift changes everything. Because now, the goal is not just income. It is expansion, growth, leverage. This is why many people stay stuck financially. They are operating from an earning mindset in a world that rewards building. Another key difference is how risk is perceived. Most people avoid risk. They see it as something dangerous, something to stay away from, because they were conditioned to believe that safety equals stability. So they choose predictable paths, secure options, low-risk decisions. But the wealthy do not avoid risk. They manage it. They understand it. They calculate it, because they know something important. Avoiding risk does not eliminate it. It just shifts it. The risk of staying the same, the risk of missed opportunities, the risk of long-term stagnation. So instead of asking, how do I avoid risk? They ask, how do I take intelligent risk? And that question leads to growth. Another psychological difference is how time is valued. Most people trade time. They think in hours, in effort, in how long something takes. But wealthy individuals think in leverage, in systems, in scale. They ask, how can I get more output from the same input? How can this work without me being involved every time? How can I multiply this? And that way of thinking removes limits. Because now, time is no longer the bottleneck. Systems are, and systems can be expanded. Another powerful shift is responsibility. Most people blame external factors, the economy, opportunities, their background, their situation. And while those things do have influence, they are not the deciding factor. Because wealthy individuals operate from responsibility. They assume control, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's difficult, even when it's not entirely their fault. Because responsibility creates power. It gives you the ability to change things, to adjust, to improve. But blame removes that power. It keeps you reactive, dependent, waiting for something outside of you to change. And that keeps you stuck. Another major difference is how failure is interpreted. Most people see failure as a stop sign, a signal that something isn't working, that they should slow down, reconsider, or quit. But the wealthy see failure differently. They see it as feedback, information, data, something to learn from, something to adjust. Because failure is part of the process, not a deviation from it. So instead of stopping, they refine, they improve, they continue. And over time, that creates progress. Because while others stop, they keep moving. Another important psychological trait is delayed gratification. The ability to sacrifice short-term comfort for long-term gain. Most people struggle with this. They want results now, rewards now, progress now. And when they don't see it, they lose motivation. They switch direction. They abandon the process. But wealth does not respond to urgency. It responds to consistency. to patience, to long-term thinking. So those who could delay gratification, those who can stay committed, those who can continue without immediate reward, they're the ones who eventually build something real. Another critical difference is belief, not in a motivational sense, but in a structural sense. What you believe is possible determines what you attempt. What you attempt determines what you experience. And what you experience reinforces your belief. So if you believe wealth is difficult, you will approach it with hesitation. If you believe it is limited, you will act cautiously. If you believe it is only for certain people, you will unconsciously hold yourself back. But if you believe it is buildable, understandable, accessible through the right actions, you behave differently. You take more initiative. You stay more consistent. You operate with confidence, and that changes your results. Another key psychological shift is thinking in terms of opportunity. Most people focus on problems, on what's not working, on what's missing, on what's difficult. And while awareness of problems is important, it does not create progress on its own. Wealthy individuals focus on opportunity, where value can be created, where systems can be improved, where gaps exist. Because opportunity drives action, it creates direction, it opens possibilities, and those possibilities lead to growth. Another overlooked factor is emotional control. Business is unpredictable. Results fluctuate. Things go wrong. Unexpected challenges appear. And if your emotions control your decisions, your actions will be inconsistent, reactive, unstable. But if you can manage your emotions, if you can stay focused despite uncertainty, despite frustration, despite temporary setbacks, you maintain direction, you stay consistent, and consistency is what builds results. So understand this clearly. Wealth is not just a result of what you do. It is a result of how you think. Because your thinking determines your actions. Your actions determine your results. And your results reinforce your thinking, creating a cycle. And if that cycle is built on limited thinking, it will produce limited outcomes, no matter how hard you work. But if that cycle is built on strategic thinking, on long-term vision, on responsibility, on leverage, on opportunity, everything begins to shift. Chapter 2. The invisible ceiling that limits your income. There's a level that most people never move beyond, not because they lack opportunity, not because they lack effort, but because something invisible is holding them in place. An internal limit, a ceiling they cannot see, but constantly operate within. This is your financial identity. The range of income, success, and growth that feels normal to you, acceptable, realistic, and everything you do tends to stay within that range. You may push above it briefly, have a good month, a strong opportunity, a period of progress, but then something happens. You slow down, you lose focus, you make decisions that pull you back, not intentionally, but subconsciously, because your identity is trying to return to what feels familiar. This is the invisible ceiling, and until you break it, you will continue cycling within the same limits, earning more, then losing it, growing, then plateauing, moving forward, then falling back, not because you are incapable, but because you're operating from a fixed internal standard, and that standard controls everything. The first sign of this ceiling is your expectations, what you believe is possible for you, not in theory, but in reality, what feels achievable, what feels within reach. Because your actions will always align with your expectations. If you expect small results, you will take small actions. If you expect limited growth, you will avoid big decisions. You will hesitate, delay, hold back, not consciously, but naturally, because you're staying within your perceived range. Another sign is your comfort level, what you're used to, what feels normal. If you're used to earning a certain amount, living a certain way, operating at a certain level, anything beyond that feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar often feels uncomfortable, even if it is better, even if it is progress. So when you begin to move beyond your current level, you may experience resistance, doubt, stress, overthinking, because your mind is trying to protect what it knows, what it understands, what feels safe. And that resistance can cause you to slow down, to retreat, to return to what feels normal. Another sign is your decision-making, the choices you make daily, how you invest your time, your energy, your attention, because your decisions reflect your identity. If you see yourself at a certain level, your decisions will match that level. You will avoid actions that feel too big, too risky, too advanced, because they don't align with how you see yourself. So even if opportunities appear, you may not take them, or you may approach them cautiously, half-committed, and that limits the outcome. Another factor is self-worth, not in a general sense, but in a financial sense. What you believe you deserve, what you believe you can handle, what you believe you are capable of managing. Because if your income grows beyond your self-worth, you may unconsciously reduce it through poor decisions, through lack of discipline, through inconsistency, because part of you does not feel comfortable at that level. So you bring yourself back down to what feels aligned. This is why some people experience cycles: growth, then decline, progress, then regression, because their identity has not expanded to support their new level. Another powerful influence is environment. The people around you, the conversations you hear, the standards you observe. If you're surrounded by individuals operating at a certain level, that level becomes your reference point. It becomes what feels normal. And exceeding that feels like stepping outside your environment, which can feel isolating, uncomfortable. So many people stay within their environment's limits without realizing it, because it feels natural. But growth requires expanding beyond that, seeing different standards, being exposed to different levels of thinking, different results, different expectations, because what you see regularly influences what you believe is possible. Another major factor is fear of change, not just failure, but success, because success changes things. It changes your responsibilities, your expectations, your identity, your environment, and that can feel overwhelming, because now you must operate differently, think differently, handle more, and if you're not prepared for that, you may resist it, even if you want it. So you stay within your current level, because it feels manageable, predictable, under control. Another reason the ceiling remains is lack of awareness. Most people don't realize it exists. They think their results are purely external, based on circumstances, opportunities, luck. So they keep trying to change external factors without addressing the internal limit. And because of that, nothing changes long-term. Short-term improvements, but no lasting growth, because the ceiling remains in place. So the question becomes, how do you break it? The first step is awareness, recognizing that your current level is not fixed. It is conditioned. It has been shaped by your experiences, your beliefs, your environment, and that means it can be changed. The second step is expanding your vision, exposing yourself to higher levels, to people who operate differently, who think bigger, who build more, because this stretches your perception. It shows you what is possible and begins to shift your internal limits. The third step is changing your standards, what you accept, what you tolerate, what you expect from yourself. Raising your standards forces your behavior to change. It pushes you beyond your current level, because now, operating at your old level is no longer acceptable. The fourth step is taking action beyond your comfort zone. Not reckless action, but intentional action. Doing things that feel slightly uncomfortable, that stretch your capacity, that expand your experience. Because action creates evidence, and evidence reshapes identity. The more you operate at a higher level, the more natural it becomes, until eventually it becomes your new baseline. Another important step is consistency. Because breaking the ceiling is not a single action. It is a process. Repeated exposure, repeated action, repeated reinforcement, until your identity shifts. And once that happens, your results follow. Because now, You are no longer operating within your old limits. You have expanded them. So understand this clearly. Your income is not just determined by what you do. It is determined by what you believe is normal for you. And until that changes, your results will stay within the same range. No matter how hard you work, no matter how many strategies you learn. Chapter 3. The shift from working hard to building smart. For most of your life, you were taught one simple idea. Work hard, and you will succeed. It sounds logical. It feels fair. It gives you a clear path. Put in effort. Stay consistent. And eventually, you will be rewarded. But when it comes to wealth, this idea is incomplete. Because hard work alone does not create scale. It creates effort-based results. And effort has limits. You can only work so many hours. You can only focus for so long. You can only produce a certain amount on your own. And that means if your income depends entirely on your effort, your growth will always be limited, no matter how hard you work. This is where the first major shift happens. From working hard to building smart, not replacing effort, but directing it differently. Because the goal is not just to work. It is to build something that works, something that continues, even when you're not actively involved. This is where most people struggle, because they are deeply conditioned to value effort, to feel productive only when they are busy, when they're working, when they're doing something. So the idea of stepping back, of building systems, of creating leverage, feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. It can feel like you're not doing enough. But in reality, you are doing something more important. You are shifting from activity to strategy. The first step in this shift is understanding the difference between input and output. Input is your effort, your time, your energy. Output is the result, the value created, the income generated. Most people focus on increasing input, working more hours, putting in more effort, doing more tasks. But the wealthy focus on increasing output, getting better results from the same or less input. And that requires thinking differently. It requires asking better questions. How can I make this more efficient? How can I produce more value from this? How can this continue without my constant involvement? And those questions lead to smarter systems. The second shift is moving from tasks to systems. A task is something you do once. It requires your direct involvement. A system is something that continues. It operates based on a process. It produces results repeatedly, without needing constant attention. Most people spend their time doing tasks, answering messages, completing work, handling problems. And while those things are necessary, they do not scale because they depend on you. But systems remove that dependency. They allow things to happen, even when you're not actively working. And that is where growth begins, because now your output is no longer tied directly to your time. Another important shift is from control to delegation. Many people try to do everything themselves because they want control, because they believe they can do it best, because they don't trust others. And while that may work at a small level, it becomes a limitation at a higher level, because you cannot scale alone. At some point, you must involve others. You must delegate. You must trust, not blindly, but strategically, because when you involve other people, you multiply your capacity. You expand your reach. You increase your output without increasing your personal workload. And that is leverage. Another shift is from linear thinking to exponential thinking. Linear thinking assumes steady, predictable growth. More effort equals slightly more results. But exponential thinking looks for multiplication, for ways to grow faster over time, to create systems that build on themselves, that compound, that accelerate. And this requires patience at the beginning, because exponential growth starts slowly. But over time, it surpasses linear effort completely. Another critical change is how you approach problems. Most people react. They solve problems as they appear, one by one, individually. But smart builders look deeper. They ask, why is this happening? What system can prevent this? How can this be solved permanently? Because solving problems at the root level creates stability. It reduces repetition. It frees up time, and that allows you to focus on growth instead of constantly managing issues. Another important shift is from short-term thinking to long-term building. When you focus only on immediate results, you make decisions that provide quick outcomes, but may limit future growth. You choose what works now instead of what builds over time. But when you think long-term, you make different choices. You invest in systems, in skills, in structures that may take time to develop, but create lasting results. And that is where real scale happens. Another key aspect of building smart is focusing on high-impact activities. Not everything you do has the same value. Some actions produce significant results. Others produce very little. But many people treat all tasks equally. They stay busy without being effective. Smart builders identify what matters most, what moves the business forward, what creates the biggest impact, and they focus on that. They eliminate low-value tasks. They delegate or automate what doesn't require their attention, and they concentrate their energy where it creates the most growth. Another important truth is this: being busy is not the same as being productive. You can spend hours working without making real progress, because activity alone does not guarantee results. What matters is direction, focus, strategy, because 1 hour spent on the right thing can produce more results than 10 hours spent on the wrong things. So understand this clearly. Working hard is not the problem, but working without direction is. Effort without strategy leads to exhaustion, but effort with strategy leads to growth. So the goal is not to stop working. It is to work differently, to think differently, to build differently, to shift from being the person who does everything to the person who designs how everything works. Because that is the real transition. From worker to builder, from operator to creator, from effort-based income to system-based growth. And once you make that shift, everything changes. Because now, you're no longer limited by your time, your energy, your capacity. You're building something that expands, something that scales, something that grows beyond you. And that is how wealth is created, not through endless effort, but through intelligent design, through systems, through leverage, through thinking differently. And once you understand that, you stop asking, how can I work more? And start asking, how can I build something that works for me? And that question is what changes everything. Chapter 4. The Power of Leverage, How the Wealthy Multiply Results. There is one concept that separates those who grow slowly from those who scale rapidly. One principle that allows a small effort to produce massive results. That principle is leverage. Most people live without it. They rely on direct effort. They work, they produce, they get paid, and the cycle repeats. Effort equals output. No effort equals no output. It is a straight line, simple, predictable, but limited, because no matter how hard you work, you are still operating within the constraints of time, energy, capacity, and those constraints cannot be expanded indefinitely. This is why hard work alone will never create massive scale, because it is linear, and linear growth has limits. Leverage breaks those limits. It allows you to produce more without increasing your direct effort. It allows your actions to extend beyond your personal capacity. And once you understand leverage, you begin to see everything differently. You stop asking, how can I do more? And start asking, how can I multiply what I do? That shift alone changes your entire approach. There are different forms of leverage, but they all share one purpose: to increase output without a proportional increase in input. The first form is time leverage, using other people's time. Instead of doing everything yourself, you involve others. You delegate tasks. You build a team, because one person can only do so much, but multiple people working together can achieve far more. This is why businesses scale through people. Because people multiply effort. They expand capacity. They allow more to be done in the same amount of time. But time leverage requires trust, structure, clear systems. Because without those, delegation creates chaos instead of growth. So it is not just about adding people. It is about organizing them effectively. The second form of leverage is system leverage, creating processes that repeat, that operate without constant input, that produce consistent results. Instead of doing something manually every time, you create a system, a structure, a method that allows the same outcome to happen again and again with minimal effort. This is what automation is built on. Systems reduce dependency on individuals. They create stability. They make results predictable. And most importantly, they free up time. Because once a system is built, it continues without needing constant attention. The third form is capital leverage, using money to create more money. Instead of relying only on effort, you invest. You allocate resources strategically. You put money into assets that generate returns. Because capital can scale faster than effort. It can move quickly. It can expand opportunities. It can accelerate growth. But capital leverage requires understanding. Because without knowledge, it can also create risk. So it must be used intentionally, not emotionally, not impulsively, but strategically. Another powerful form of leverage is knowledge leverage, using what you know to create value at scale. This includes skills, expertise, experience, insights. When you package knowledge into systems, products, content, you extend its reach. You allow it to impact more people without repeating the same effort every time. One idea can create multiple outcomes. One system can generate continuous results, and that is leverage in its purest form. Another important form is technology leverage, using tools, platforms, digital systems to expand your reach, to automate processes, to increase efficiency. Technology allows one person to reach thousands, even millions, without being physically present, without repeating the same action. And that changes everything, because now, scale is no longer limited by location or direct interaction. It is driven by systems and reach. But here's where most people go wrong. They try to scale without first understanding leverage. They increase effort. They work harder. They do more. But they don't build systems. They don't delegate. They don't create structures. So they hit a ceiling. They burn out. They feel stuck because they're trying to grow linearly in a system that requires multiplication. Another mistake is seeking control over everything, trying to manage every detail, every decision, every process, because it feels safer. But control limits leverage, because the more you control, the more dependent everything becomes on you. And dependency prevents scale. So leverage requires letting go, not completely, but strategically, letting systems operate, letting people contribute, letting processes run, because that is how things expand. Another important truth is this. Leverage takes time to build. At the beginning, it feels slower. Creating systems takes effort. Training people takes time. Building structures requires patience. And during that phase, it may feel easier to just do everything yourself, to stay in control, to move quickly. But that short-term speed creates long-term limits, because without leverage, growth eventually stops. So the willingness to invest time now, to build leverage, creates exponential results later. This is why wealthy individuals focus heavily on building leverage early, because they understand effort builds income. Leverage builds wealth. Income requires continuous work. Wealth continues even when you stop working, because it is supported by systems, by structures, by assets that operate independently. So understand this clearly. If your income depends entirely on your effort, you're not scaled. You're operating at capacity, and capacity has limits. But if your income is supported by leverage, you're building something that can grow, that can expand, that can operate beyond your direct involvement. And that is where real wealth is created, not through more effort, but through multiplication, through systems, through people, through capital, through knowledge, through technology, all working together to extend your reach. And once you begin to think this way, you stop trying to do everything. You start building structures that do the work for you. You shift from effort to expansion, from limitation to scale. And that is the power of leverage, the ability to turn one action into many results. And that is how wealth is multiplied. Chapter 5. The habits that quietly control your financial future. Most people focus on big decisions, big opportunities, big moves. They believe wealth is built in moments, in breakthroughs, in one major action that changes everything. But that is not how it works. Wealth is built quietly, in small, repeated actions, in daily habits that seem insignificant, but shape your direction over time. Because what you do once has very little impact, but what you do consistently defines your results. And this is where most people lose, not because they lack ambition, but because their habits are working against them, quietly, consistently, without them even realizing it. The first habit that controls your financial future is how you use your time, not occasionally, but daily. What you focus on, what you prioritize, what you give your attention to, because time is your most valuable resource. Once it is used, it cannot be recovered. So if your time is spent on low-value activities, distractions, things that do not move you forward, your progress slows. Even if you are busy, because being busy is not the same as building. Building requires intentional use of time, focused effort, directed action, and most people do not track this. They let their time be consumed instead of invested. Another powerful habit is how you respond to discomfort, because growth always involves discomfort. Learning something new, taking risks, making decisions, facing uncertainty, all of it feels uncomfortable. And your response to that discomfort determines your progress. If you avoid it, you stay where you are. If you move toward it, you expand. But most people choose comfort, not consciously, but automatically. They delay difficult tasks. They avoid challenging decisions. They distract themselves when things feel hard. And over time, this builds a pattern of avoidance. And that pattern limits growth. Another habit that shapes your future is your financial behavior. Not what you say about money, but what you actually do with it. How you spend, how you save, how you invest. Because money reflects behavior. If you consume everything you earn, there is nothing left to build with. If you spend impulsively, you reduce your capacity to grow. If you avoid learning how money works, you limit your ability to manage it. So wealth is not just about earning more. It is about managing better, using money intentionally, directing it toward growth, instead of just consumption. Another important habit is consistency, not intensity, not occasional bursts of effort, but steady, repeated action. Because consistency compounds. Small actions, repeated over time, create significant results. But inconsistency breaks that. It resets progress. It delays outcomes. It creates instability. And many people operate in cycles. High effort, then low effort. Focus, then distraction. Progress, then pause. And that pattern prevents momentum, because momentum requires continuity. Another powerful habit is learning, not passive consumption, but active improvement, developing skills, understanding systems, refining your thinking, because the more you understand, the better your decisions become, and better decisions lead to better outcomes. But many people stop learning once they leave school, or they consume information without applying it. So their knowledge does not translate into results, because learning without action does not create change. Another key habit is how you handle money emotionally. Do you react impulsively? Do you make decisions based on fear, on excitement, on pressure? Or do you remain calm, strategic, intentional? Because emotions can distort judgment. They can lead to poor decisions, short-term thinking, unnecessary risk, or missed opportunities. So emotional control is not just important in business. It is critical in financial decisions. Another habit that often goes unnoticed is your environment, who you spend time with, what you listen to, what you expose your mind to daily. Because your environment influences your thinking, your standards, your expectations. If you are surrounded by people who think small, who avoid risk, who settle for average, that becomes your reference point. But if you're exposed to higher standards, to growth-focused thinking, to people building and expanding, your perspective shifts, and that influences your behavior. Another important habit is how you handle setbacks. Because setbacks are inevitable. Things will go wrong. Plans will fail. Results will not always match effort. And your response to that determines your direction. If you stop, you lose momentum. If you learn and continue, you grow. But many people take setbacks personally. They see them as failure, as proof that they're not capable. And that belief slows them down or stops them completely. But setbacks are part of the process, not the end of it. Another powerful habit is decision-making speed. Not rushing, but avoiding unnecessary delay. Many people overthink. They hesitate. They wait for perfect clarity, perfect timing, perfect conditions. But those do not exist. So they stay stuck, while others move forward, adjust, improve, and progress. Because action creates clarity, not the other way around. Another overlooked habit is finishing. Starting is easy. There is excitement, energy, motivation, but finishing requires discipline. Pushing through when things slow down, when excitement fades, when results are not immediate. And most people stop before finishing. They move on, start something new, repeat the cycle. But without finishing, there are no real results, only attempts. So understand this clearly. Your financial future is not determined by one decision, one opportunity, one moment. It is determined by your habits, your daily actions, your repeated behaviors, because those actions shape your direction. And over time, your direction becomes your results. So if you want to change your outcomes, you do not start with big moves. You start with small changes in how you use your time, how you handle discomfort, how you manage money, how consistent you are, how you learn, how you think. Because once those habits align, everything else begins to shift, not instantly, but steadily. And that steady progress is what creates lasting results. Because in the end, success is not built in moments. It is built in routines, quietly, consistently, over time. And those who understand that are the ones who eventually build something real. Not because they did something extraordinary once, but because they did the right things, repeatedly, until it worked. Chapter 6. Scaling beyond yourself. Building systems that work without you. There comes a point in every business where effort is no longer enough, where working harder stops producing better results, where adding more hours does not increase growth. And that point is where most people get stuck, because they try to solve a structural problem with more effort. They push harder, they work longer, they take on more, but nothing changes, because the problem is not effort. It is dependency. Everything depends on them. Every decision, every task, every process, every result. And as long as that dependency exists, growth will always have a limit. Because you have a limit. Your time, your energy, your capacity. So the real shift is not about working more. It is about building something that works without you. This is where scaling begins. Not when you do more, but when you become less involved in the day-to-day execution. And that requires systems, because systems replace dependence. They create structure, consistency, repeatability. They allow things to happen without constant supervision, without constant effort. without constant involvement. But most people resist this shift because it requires letting go of control, letting go of doing everything themselves, letting go of the idea that they must be involved in every detail. And that is uncomfortable because control feels safe, familiar, predictable. But control also limits growth because the more you control, the more everything depends on you. And dependency prevents scale. So the first step in building systems is recognizing where you are the bottleneck, where things stop without you, where decisions are delayed, where processes break, where progress slows, because those areas are where systems are needed. The second step is documenting what you do. Most people operate from memory, from instinct, from habit. They know how things work, but it is not written, not structured, not defined, and that creates inconsistency, because what is not defined cannot be repeated reliably. So documenting processes turns knowledge into structure. It creates clarity. It allows others to understand, to follow, to execute, without constant instruction. The third step is simplifying. Many people overcomplicate systems. They create unnecessary steps, unclear processes, complex structures. But complexity slows everything down. It creates confusion, errors, inefficiency. So effective systems are simple, clear, direct, easy to follow, because simplicity creates speed, and speed creates efficiency. Another important step is delegation. Once systems are in place, tasks can be handed off, not randomly, but strategically, to people who can execute them. And this is where trust becomes essential. Not blind trust, but structured trust, supported by systems, by clear expectations, by defined outcomes. Because when people know what to do and how to do it, they perform better. And that allows you to step back, to focus on higher level decisions, on growth, on direction, instead of daily operations. Another key part of scaling is creating feedback loops. Systems are not perfect from the start. They require adjustment, refinement, improvement. So feedback becomes critical. Understanding what is working, what is not, where improvements can be made. Because systems evolve, they improve over time. And that improvement increases efficiency, consistency, results. Another important concept is removing yourself from repetitive tasks. Anything that happens frequently should not depend on you, because repetition creates opportunity for systems, automation, delegation. So the more you remove yourself from repetition, the more time you free up, and that time can be used for growth, strategy, expansion. Another shift is from doing to overseeing. Instead of being involved in every detail, you monitor outcomes, you review performance, you make adjustments when needed. But you're not directly involved in execution. And that changes your role completely. From operator to leader, from worker to builder. Because now, you're not creating results directly. You're creating the system that creates results. And that is where scale happens. Another important truth is this. Systems create consistency. Consistency creates reliability. Reliability creates trust. And trust allows growth, because when your business operates consistently, you can expand with confidence. You can handle more volume, more clients, more opportunities, without chaos, without breakdowns, without constant stress. Another benefit of systems is freedom, not just financial, but operational. Because when your business runs without you, you're no longer tied to it constantly. You can step away, focus on other areas, explore new opportunities, without everything stopping. And that is the real goal. Not just building a business, but building something that functions independently, something that continues, even when you are not present. But this requires patience, because building systems takes time, effort, planning. And at the beginning, it may feel slower. It may feel easier to just do things yourself, to move quickly, to stay in control. But that short-term speed creates long-term limits, because without systems, growth eventually stops. So the willingness to slow down now, to build structure, creates long-term acceleration. Because once systems are in place, everything becomes easier, more efficient, more scalable. So understand this clearly. If your business cannot run without you, it is not scalable. It is dependent, and dependency limits growth. But when you build systems, when you remove yourself from daily execution, when you create structure, you unlock something powerful, the ability to grow beyond your own capacity, to scale without increasing effort, to build something that operates independently. And that is what separates a small operation from a scalable business. Not effort, not talent, but structure, systems, and the willingness to build them. Because once you do, your business no longer depends on you. It grows beyond you. And that is where real scale begins. Chapter 7. The discipline of long-term thinking. Most people think short-term, not because they want to, but because it feels natural. Immediate results, quick rewards, fast feedback. You do something, and you expect to see something happen. And when that doesn't happen, you question it. You doubt it. You lose momentum because your focus is on now, on what is visible, on what is happening in the moment. But wealth is not built in the short term. It is built through long-term thinking, through decisions that may not show results immediately, but create outcomes over time. And this is where most people struggle, because long-term thinking requires discipline. It requires patience. It requires the ability to continue without constant validation, without immediate proof, without instant reward. And that is uncomfortable because the brain is wired for quick results, for immediate satisfaction, for things that feel good now. So when something takes time, when results are delayed, it feels like it's not working, even when it is. This is why many people quit too early. They start something, they put in effort, they stay consistent for a short period. But when results don't appear quickly, they stop, they switch direction, they try something new, and that resets the process. Again, and again, and again. But wealth does not respond to switching. It responds to staying, to committing, to allowing time to do its work. Because time is a multiplier, but only for those who use it correctly. The first shift in long-term thinking is understanding compounding, not just financially, but in effort, in habits, in decisions. Small actions, repeated over time, do not produce linear results. They produce exponential outcomes. But that only happens if you stay consistent long enough. Because at the beginning, compounding is invisible. You put in effort, and nothing seems to change. You stay disciplined, and results feel small. You remain consistent, and progress feels slow, and that creates doubt, because it looks like nothing is happening. But what you don't see is accumulation. Skills are improving, systems are forming, habits are strengthening, and all of that builds beneath the surface. Then at some point, it becomes visible. Results begin to increase. Progress accelerates. Momentum builds, but only for those who stayed. Another key aspect of long-term thinking is delayed gratification, choosing what benefits you later over what feels good now. And this applies to everything: time, money, effort, focus, because every decision you make has a short-term effect and a long-term effect. And most people choose the short-term benefit because it is immediate, it is visible, it is satisfying. But those choices accumulate, and over time, they create a pattern that limits growth. But when you choose long-term benefits, you make different decisions. You invest time instead of wasting it. You build instead of consume. You save and invest instead of spending impulsively. You focus instead of distracting yourself. And those decisions compound, creating different outcomes. Another important shift is how you measure progress. Most people measure based on immediate results, daily outcomes, short-term feedback. But long-term thinkers measure differently. They look at direction. at consistency, at whether they are improving. Because they understand, results follow behavior, not the other way around. So instead of asking, "Is this working right now?" they ask, "Am I doing the right things consistently?" And that question keeps them moving forward, even when results are not yet visible. Another challenge in long-term thinking is dealing with uncertainty, because the future is not guaranteed. There are no clear outcomes, no exact timelines, no perfect predictions. So acting long-term requires operating without full certainty. And that is uncomfortable, because the mind wants clarity. It wants guarantees. It wants proof. But long-term builders move forward anyway. They accept uncertainty. They focus on what they can control: their actions, their decisions, their consistency, because that is what shapes outcomes. Another critical element is ignoring distractions, because short-term thinking is everywhere. Quick money, fast success, instant results. And those ideas are appealing. They promise speed, ease, immediate reward, but they often lack depth, structure, sustainability. So long-term thinkers stay focused. They avoid jumping from one opportunity to another. They commit to a direction, and they build within it, even when something new appears, even when something looks easier, because they understand. Switching delays progress. Focus accelerates it. Another important habit is patience with growth, not passive waiting, but active patience, continuing to work, continuing to improve, continuing to build, while understanding that results take time. Because impatience leads to poor decisions, rushed actions, abandoning strategies too early. But patience allows processes to develop, to stabilize, to produce results. Another key mindset is thinking in years, not days, not weeks, not even months, but years. Because meaningful results take time. Building something real requires sustained effort, consistent direction, repeated improvement over a long period. And when you think in years, short-term setbacks lose their impact. A bad day doesn't matter. A slow week is not a problem. Even a difficult month is just part of the process, because your focus is on the bigger picture, the long-term outcome, and that keeps you stable. Another powerful shift is seeing time as an asset, not something to spend, but something to invest. Every action you take is an investment of time, of energy, of focus, and those investments produce returns, not instantly, but over time. So the question becomes, is this a good investment of my time? And that question changes your behavior. It makes you more intentional, more focused, more disciplined. So understand this clearly. Long-term thinking is not natural. It must be developed. It must be practiced. It must be reinforced, because the world pushes you toward short-term thinking, toward quick results, toward immediate satisfaction. But those who build wealth resist that. They operate differently. They focus on consistency, on compounding, on direction, on patience, because they understand time is not the enemy. It is the advantage. Chapter 8. Building systems that make success repeatable. Most people don't fail because they can't succeed once. They fail because they can't repeat success. They might get a result, close a sale, launch a product, earn a good month, have a breakthrough moment. But after that, everything becomes unstable again. They have to figure it out all over. They go back to guessing, back to effort, back to inconsistency. And the reason is simple. They don't have systems. They have actions, not structures. And that difference is everything. Because actions create results once, but systems create results repeatedly, without starting over, without relying on memory, without depending on motivation. A system is a designed way of doing things that produces a predictable outcome. It removes randomness. It removes emotional decision-making. It removes chaos and replaces it with structure. But most people never build systems because they are too focused on doing, not designing. They are inside the work, not above it. They are executing tasks, instead of building the machine that executes tasks for them. And that keeps them stuck at a certain level. Because without systems, everything depends on personal effort, and personal effort is limited. The first step in building systems is identifying repetition. Anything you do more than once is a candidate for a system. Answering the same type of message, doing the same kind of task, solving the same type of problem, repeating the same workflow. If it repeats, it should be systemized, because repetition without structure creates inefficiency, but repetition with structure creates scale. The second step is simplification. Most people think systems must be complex, detailed, sophisticated, but complexity is not what makes systems powerful. Clarity is. A system should be simple enough that someone else can follow it without confusion. Because if a system only works in your head, it is not a system. It is knowledge, and knowledge is not scalable. So systems must be written, defined, broken down into steps, clear enough to be repeated without interpretation. The third step is consistency of process. A system only works if it is followed the same way each time, because inconsistency breaks predictability, and without predictability, there is no scale. So the goal is not to improvise every time. It is to standardize execution, so results become stable, repeatable, reliable. The fourth step is removing yourself from the system, because if you are still required for every part of the process, you haven't built a system. You have built a routine. A real system continues without you. It operates independently. It produces results even when you're not directly involved. And this is where most people struggle, because letting go feels risky. It feels like losing control. But in reality, it is gaining scale, because your time is limited. But a system is not. The fifth step is delegation. Once a system is clear, it can be handed to someone else. Not randomly, but with structure, with expectations, with guidance. So that execution does not depend on your presence, but on the system itself. And when multiple people operate within systems, output multiplies without increasing your personal workload. This is how businesses grow beyond individuals, not through effort, but through structure. Another important part of systems is feedback loops. A system is not something you build once and forget. It is something you refine. You observe results. You identify gaps. You improve steps. You adjust inefficiencies. Because systems evolve, and the better they evolve, the more powerful they become. Another key idea is automation. Once a process is stable, it can be automated. Not everything, but parts of it. Tools, software, workflows that reduce manual effort and increase consistency, because automation removes human error and increases efficiency. But automation only works when systems already exist. Without systems, automation just amplifies chaos. Another important concept is leverage through systems. A system allows one action to produce multiple outcomes, one process to serve multiple results, one structure to handle repeated work. And that is where scale begins, because now your output is no longer tied to your effort. It is tied to your design, your structure, your thinking. Another truth most people miss is that systems reduce stress because uncertainty disappears. You are no longer wondering what to do next. You are not reacting constantly. You are not rebuilding processes every time. You simply follow what has already been defined, and that creates stability, clarity, confidence. Another benefit is consistency of results. Without systems, results fluctuate. Some good days, some bad days, some progress, some setbacks. But with systems, results stabilize because the process is consistent. And consistency creates predictability. And predictability creates growth. Another important shift is moving from doing the work to designing the work. Most people stay stuck in execution. They focus on tasks, on output, on daily activity. But system builders focus on design. They ask, how should this work be done? What is the best process? How can this be repeated easily? How can this be improved? And that thinking creates scale. Because design multiplies effort. Execution only uses it. So understand this clearly. If everything in your business depends on you, you do not have a system. You have responsibility overload. But when you build systems, you create structure that operates independently. You reduce dependency. You increase output. You free your time. And you open the door to scale. Because scaling is not doing more. It is designing better. So the real question is not, how hard am I working? It is, how well is my system designed? Because the quality of your system determines the ceiling of your growth. And once you understand that, you stop trying to work harder and start building smarter. You stop being the engine and start building the machine. And that is where real scale begins. Chapter 9. Why most businesses never break past survival mode. Most businesses don't fail in dramatic ways. They don't collapse overnight. They don't disappear suddenly. They stay alive, but stuck, barely growing, barely scaling, barely surviving. And that is actually worse than failure, because failure ends the story. Stagnation keeps it going, without progress. And the reason most businesses stay stuck is not lack of effort, it is lack of structure for growth. They can operate, they can function, they can even generate income, but they cannot scale. They cannot expand. They cannot break past a certain level. And the business becomes a loop. The same problems, the same income range, the same operational stress, repeated over and over again. The first reason this happens is owner dependency. The business is the owner. Every decision flows through one person. Every approval, every solution, every problem. And when that person stops, everything slows down because nothing is designed to operate independently. This creates a ceiling because one person cannot scale infinitely. Another reason is lack of clear roles. In small businesses, everyone does everything. Tasks overlap. Responsibilities are unclear. Work becomes reactive. And instead of structure, there is chaos management. This works temporarily, but not long-term, because as the business grows, chaos grows with it. Another issue is absence of predictable systems. Most businesses rely on effort, on hustle, on reacting to situations as they come. But there are no consistent processes, no repeatable workflows, no defined methods. So every result feels like starting over. And without predictability, scaling becomes impossible because you cannot scale what is not stable. Another major reason is weak decision-making structure. In many businesses, decisions are made emotionally, or quickly, or without enough information, and that leads to inconsistency. Some decisions are good, some are not, but there is no framework guiding them. So outcomes fluctuate, and the business never stabilizes. Another hidden problem is lack of focus. Many businesses try to do too much, too many services, too many products, too many directions, because they're chasing opportunity. But in doing so, they lose clarity. And without clarity, resources are spread thin, effort is diluted, results become average. Focus is what creates strength, but distraction creates fragmentation. Another reason businesses stay stuck is inability to delegate effectively. Even when there are employees, the owner still controls everything, still checks everything, still intervenes constantly, because there is no trust in systems, and no systems strong enough to replace oversight. So delegation becomes fake delegation. Work is assigned, but still depends on approval, and that limits scale, because nothing moves independently. Another critical issue is short-term thinking. Many businesses focus only on immediate survival. This month's sales, this week's problems, this day's pressure. And while survival is important, it does not build structure. It does not build systems. It does not build long-term growth. So the business becomes reactive, always responding, never building. Another factor is lack of reinvestment. Instead of reinvesting into systems, processes, people, tools, owners often pull everything out, treating the business like income instead of an engine. And that prevents expansion because nothing is being strengthened. Everything is being consumed. Another major reason is absence of scalability thinking. Most businesses are built to function at a small level, not designed for growth, not designed for volume, not designed for expansion. So when demand increases, the system breaks because it was never designed to handle more. And instead of scaling smoothly, it collapses under pressure. Another issue is inconsistent quality. Without systems, output varies. Some work is good, some is rushed, some is overlooked, and that inconsistency damages trust because customers expect reliability, not variation. And without consistency, growth becomes unstable. Another hidden barrier is emotional attachment to how things are done. Many owners resist change because they're used to certain methods, certain routines, certain ways of operating. Even when those methods are inefficient, they feel familiar, and familiarity often feels safer than improvement. So change is avoided, even when it is necessary. But businesses that scale are constantly evolving, constantly improving systems, constantly refining processes, because what worked at a small level does not work at a larger one. Another important factor is lack of measurement. Many businesses do not track what matters. They rely on feeling, on rough estimates, on general understanding. But without data, there is no clarity. And without clarity, there is no direction for improvement. So problems repeat without being solved properly. Another reason businesses stay stuck is founder burnout. Because when everything depends on one person, the workload becomes unsustainable. Energy drops, decision fatigue increases, motivation weakens, and the business slows down, not because it cannot grow, but because the system is overloaded. So the real issue is not effort, it is design, because businesses that scale are not built around effort. They are built around structure, systems, delegation, clarity, focus, and long-term thinking. So the shift required is simple, but powerful. Stop building a job for yourself. Start building a system that runs independently. Because when your business depends on you, it cannot grow beyond you. But when your business does not depend on you, it can scale without limits. And that is the difference between survival and expansion, between stagnation and growth, between working in a business and building one that grows on its own. Chapter 10. The final shift from business builder to wealth builder. At this point, something important should be clear. You now understand how wealth is formed. You understand psychology. You understand systems. You understand leverage. You understand long-term thinking. You understand structure. And you understand why most businesses stay stuck. But understanding something is not the same as becoming it, because there's a final shift most people never make. And that shift is not about strategy. It is about identity. It is about how you see yourself in relation to the business you are building. Most people see themselves as operators, as workers inside their business. Even when they own it, they're still inside it, solving problems, handling tasks, putting out fires, being involved in everything. And because of that, they remain trapped inside the system they created. But wealth begins when that identity changes, when you stop seeing yourself as the person who does the work and start seeing yourself as the person who designs what the work becomes. That shift changes everything, because now your focus is no longer execution. It is structure. It is direction. It is leverage. It is systems. It is thinking at a higher level, not inside the business, but above it. Another important realization is this. You are not building a business to work in it forever. You are building it to eventually step back from it, to allow it to function independently, to let it operate without your constant involvement. Because if your presence is required for everything, then you have not built freedom. You have built dependency, and that dependency becomes your limit. So the final goal is not more income, not more tasks, not more effort. The final goal is independence for the business and for you. Another critical shift is understanding the difference between control and influence. Most people try to control everything, every detail, every decision, every outcome, but control does not scale. Influence does. Systems create influence. Leverage creates influence. Structure creates influence. Because now, things happen the way you intended, without you forcing them in real time. That is real power. Not being involved in everything, but designing everything so it works without you. Another important truth is that growth eventually demands detachment. Not emotional detachment from your work, but operational detachment. The ability to step back, to allow others to execute, to allow systems to run, to trust what you have built. Because without detachment, you remain the bottleneck, even in a successful business. And that blocks scale. Another shift is thinking in layers. Most people think in one layer. Do the work, get results. But wealth builders think in multiple layers. Design system, build structure, create leverage, generate output, refine system, expand capacity. Each layer supports the next. And the higher you go, the less you rely on direct effort, and the more you rely on design. Another key realization is this. Your business will only grow to the level of your thinking. Not your effort, not your time, but your thinking. Because thinking determines structure. Structure determines scale. And scale determines results. So if you keep thinking like an operator, you will always build operator-level results. But if you start thinking like a designer, you begin building systems that grow beyond you. Another important concept is sustainability. A business that relies on constant pressure, constant urgency, constant involvement will eventually collapse or plateau because it is not built to last. But a business built on systems, on delegation, on structure, on clarity can grow sustainably without burnout, without chaos, without dependency. Another truth most people ignore is that simplicity wins long-term. Complex businesses are fragile. Simple systems are strong because simplicity reduces failure points. It increases clarity. It improves execution, and it makes scaling easier. So the goal is not complexity. It is clarity, not more, but better, not harder, but smarter. And finally, the last shift is this. Stop measuring success by how much you are doing. Start measuring success by how much your system can do without you. Because that is the real indicator of wealth. Not how busy you are, not how hard you work, but how independent what you built has become. So if you take one thing from this entire journey, let it be this. Wealth is not built by staying inside the business. It is built by stepping above it, designing it, structuring it, scaling it, and eventually allowing it to run without you. Because that is when business stops being a job and becomes an asset. And that is the final shift. From operator to builder, from builder to designer, from designer to someone who has created something that no longer depends on them. And that is where real wealth begins.